The Gospel of John, chapter 2, verses 13 through 22. You are invited to follow along with your Bibles if you have them. There are some underneath the chairs. You have your own. And the scripture reads, "The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, 'Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace.' Now his disciples remembered that it was written, 'Zeal for your house will consume me.' So the Jews then said to him, 'What sign can you show us for doing this?' And Jesus answered them, 'Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.' The Jews then said, 'This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and will you raise it up in 3 days?' But he was speaking of the temple of his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken." The word of the Lord for the people of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I'm going to try something a little different today, and I'm going to see if I can preach from my phone. I'm used to printing out a sermon, but I trust you all. This is an internship, and I'm trying to learn new things, so I appreciate you all being willing to go along with me as I try this new thing out.
Hope the battery's charged up.
I charged it this morning, so it should be good to go. And I appreciate the concern. So I would love to start out this sermon by actually sharing with you all a children's story. There was a story written back in 1970 by a gentleman named Fred Gwynne called "The King Who Reigned." And the story focuses on a child who is being told some things by her parents and is misinterpreting what they are saying to her. For example, the story starts out by the child saying, "Daddy once told me that there is a king who reigned for 40 days. Now, in her mind, she sees a king floating in the sky like a cloud, literally raining water on the earth.
Right.
She doesn't quite understand that there's a different meaning to the word rain." Another example from the story, the little girl says, "Daddy tells me that there are forks in the road." Now for her, she is imagining these giant forks that are a part of the road that they are driving on, not understanding that there is a different definition for a fork in the road, when the road splits into two. A third example from the story is when the child says, "Mommy tells me that sometimes she gets a frog in her throat." And the daughter imagines that her mom has a literal frog in her throat and is, very concerned about her mom because she doesn't understand that there is a different meaning to the phrase, "you have a frog in your throat." When it's sore or hoarse, you might be sick. The child is taking what she knows and is applying it to what she is hearing. And I think that this speaks to our passage today. Now, let me set the scene for you all. As we heard in the scripture, the Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." Now, as we heard last week from Chris, the temple was very important to the Jewish people, and folks would travel long distances to get there. People would go there for healing and to give offering to their God. The faithful at this time believed that God was in the temple, in the Holy of Holies. Now, the temple at this time was built back in the 6th century BCE, hundreds of years ago prior to our story today. And renovations and enlargements began about 20 BCE. So construction on this temple has been going on, as we heard, for over 40 years. So for some of the disciples that were listening and seeing this interaction, either their entire lives the temple has been getting prepared back to what it used to be, or for the majority of their lives. But the temple is very important. So, when they see these money changers and these people trying to make a profit at the gate of the temple, it makes a lot of sense that they would be upset about that. This is their holy place, and people are turning it into a marketplace. Now, what I think is interesting is that normally in this story, we might hear sermons or messages focused on Christ's response to the money changers and throwing them out. But today, I want us to focus on the response of the disciples. See, in verse 17, the disciples say that they remember it was written, "The zeal for your house will consume me." And the Jews then said to him, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" Now that phrase, "zeal for your house will consume me," the disciples were very familiar with their Hebrew Bible, with their Old Testament. And they were recalling one of the Psalms where the psalmist is this enthusiastic supporter for the rebuilding of the temple. This person is so excited that it will be returned to the glory that it used to be at because of how important the temple is to them. And the followers of Christ are asking Jesus, "What sign can you show us that this temple is going to be rebuilt? We have this huge faith that this is going to happen." And how does Jesus answer? Jesus says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." And his followers reply, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years. And will you raise it up in 3 days?" Some of them may have been thinking, Jesus said, "What? We have seen this construction happen our entire lives. And we know that Christ can perform miracles, but truly this would be an amazing thing if this temple that is so important to us is destroyed and Christ can bring it back in 3 days. That surely would have been a marvelous thing." However, I think our disciples are like the child from the story that we heard earlier, the king who reigned. They don't understand yet that Jesus isn't talking about the temple where the money changers were. He is talking about his body. And it says in verse 21 that Christ was speaking of the temple of his body. So, in the Gospel of John, the folks who are reading this gospel or hearing it told for the first time are years removed from Christ's death and resurrection. The earliest that we know of that this gospel may have been written would have been maybe the mid 75 CE to 80 CE. And that's important because this very temple that is referenced in the gospel is destroyed in 70 CE. the Jewish people rebelled against the Roman Empire, and the empire said, you can't do this to us. We need to destroy something that's very important to you. And they came in and destroyed the temple. So people who would have been hearing the story would have known that the temple was not going to be built back in their lifetime. But they also understood that John tried to show the disciples' misunderstanding as a way of encouraging the listeners and readers to look more closely at what Jesus is saying. To be aware that there may be a deeper or even multiple levels of meaning elsewhere in the gospel. What all of this says is that God acts in ways that we might not fully understand. We might think, as the disciples did, that God is going to do one thing, and this one thing is going to be so marvelous. Rebuild the temple in 3 days? But when we finally realize what God does, that he dies on the cross and 3 days later he is resurrected, that is a miracle far larger and more beautiful than anything the disciples had ever hoped for. As we start to understand what the story of the gospel is about, we see that God is bigger and more powerful than we could have ever imagined. We hear in verse 22 that after he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. There is this hope in remembering and in believing. Now, let's go back to the King Who Reigns children's story for a moment. As the listeners and the readers of this story, it is funnier to us because we understand the multiple meanings of the words that the child doesn't quite get. We can see, we know that there aren't giant forks in the road, or that we don't have frogs in our throat. That is telling us something much more than that. And that the first people who would have been hearing the Gospel of John are sort of like us today, that they understand that there is a deeper meaning than what those first disciples may have understood. And I think that we currently live in a world where we have members not just of our community here in Rising Hope or in Alexandria, but in Virginia, in our country, in our world, who are more like the child in our story and are more like the disciples who were with Christ in Jerusalem. That they have this yearning to be with Jesus and to follow him, but that some of us might be missing what that deeper meaning is. And that's not our fault. We are taking what we already know and are trying to apply that to what we are hearing Christ say. And I also believe that in these same communities, there are folks like the reader of the children's story, like the readers who would have heard and read the first versions of the Gospel of John, who get that there is a deeper meaning to this Jesus story than what might first meet the eye. And I ask, throughout this week, to take some time to see who you might identify with. Do you see yourself as the child and the disciple who wants this relationship with Jesus, but may be missing something deeper? Or do you see yourself as the readers of these stories, someone who understands that there are these deep and complex levels to the gospel? And I think that if we see ourselves in that second group, then it is our responsibility to be in a community where those who are like the children can come and learn, who can come and be in a place where they can experience this deep love of Christ. Because the deeper our relationship with Christ, the more easily it will be able for us to see and understand how beautiful and miraculous this faith is. So I invite you to take an opportunity to even potentially, we have a Wednesday night Bible study where we dive deeper. We have a Sunday morning Sunday school class where we dive deeper. We have folks sitting next to you who are hungry for the Word, who are hungry for a deeper relationship with Christ. And I invite you to get to know the folks that are sitting next to you and sitting around you, and to find out if you all, and if all of us, want to have this deeper relationship with God. So that even when we come to moments in the gospel or in our lives where we might be wondering, Jesus said, what? That we don't just stop there. That we go the extra mile. That we remember that we have our scripture, that we have our community, that we have our tradition, and we have our experience to help inform and grow this faith. So friends, will you pray with me? Most gracious and loving God, we know that we do not always understand how you are moving and shaking this world. But we hope and we get glimpses that when we see and feel your miracles and your power in this world, that it is grander and more beautiful than anything we could have ever hoped for. Help us to be the community, to be the church that shares this love with those that we need. We love you, God. Amen.